In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You may be seated. I should say, for those of you who it looks like that candle is not lit, it is in fact lit. When I lived in Scotland and I was an acolyte, we called those Presbyterian candles because they wanted to catch the flame, they just couldn't quite do it. Yesterday morning, my family and I finished reading The Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis. And if you haven't read it, you should totally go and read it. I don't care if you're 8 or if you're 68. It's great. There's this wonderful moment when the 3 children who are the main characters of the book, along with this little mouse named Reepicheep, they reach the end of the world. And it isn't like people used to imagine the earth when they thought it was flat. You got to the end and then you fell off the edge. This is different. As they get closer, it looks like glass. And then they realize it's a wave of water going up. And you can see through that wave of water. So when the sun rises the morning they get there, they can actually see beyond the wave another country, a world beyond the world. They see mountains so tall that they cannot see the tops of those mountains, and yet they still don't see any snow on them. Again, it is a world beyond the world. In this book, it is Aslan's country. So with all the talk of mountains, you can imagine why when I was reading this out loud to Jonah on Friday night, and then he fell asleep, so we had to finish it Saturday morning, it chimed with me because we're reading about mountains this morning. We have them in both Exodus and in Luke. You go up the mountain in these stories to encounter God. That's what Moses does. He has just been up there encountering God. He has heard God's voice. He has seen God. You might say Moses has seen the world beyond the world. He has heard the revelation of God's name. And now he returns to the Israelites. He goes down the mountain to those people who just a few chapters earlier had broken the first covenant God made with them and begun to worship idols. So as Moses comes to them, they see that his face is shining. His encounter with God has changed the very appearance of his flesh. You see the world beyond the world, and it changes you physically. And that is terrifying to the Israelites. So terrifying that Moses has to kind of coax them to come closer, but eventually they draw near, and he shares with them the commands of God. And then you get that kind of weird detail about the veil. Moses removes it when he speaks with God and when he speaks to the Israelites, but then he wears it, it seems, at those times when he is not working in his capacity as the one through whom God speaks. Now, in the history of interpretation, people do a lot of things with that veil. And you get to see one of them in Paul this morning, where he suggests that Moses puts the veil over his face because the glory was fading. And Paul suggests that this fading is somehow part of what God's plan for the law was. In other words, Paul suggests that Moses would eventually be seen as diminishing in importance, not because Moses is unimportant, but because Moses would be revealed to be what he always was. One who points away from himself towards the Messiah, one who prepares the covenant that will be fulfilled by another Israelite, Jesus. The point is that Moses' glory is a reflected glory. Moses has the supremely important role of bringing God's law to God's people, but the glory he has on his face that shines is reflecting God's glory. In other words, there are still heights to the mountain that people don't have access to, that not even Moses has access to. There is still a world beyond that wave at the end of the world. Which brings us to the story in Luke. And Luke has written it in such a way that we are supposed to think about this story about Moses, which is why the designers of the lectionary put them together on this last Sunday of Epiphany. Moses has to go in and, let's say, have his glory topped up. He goes into the tent and then he comes back out. That's not what we're going to find out happens to Jesus. Jesus takes his disciples up the mountain to pray. Like with Moses, Jesus' face begins to shine, and his clothes become so white that the Greeks say they are the white of flashing lightning. Then Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus. They talk about, and this is the word in Greek, Jesus' exodus, his departure at Jerusalem. We are, of course, meant to connect what Jesus is about to do in Jerusalem to Israel's rescue from Egypt, the Exodus. Except we all know the story that happens to Jesus. He's going to go to Jerusalem to die. And we're going to come back in a minute to how that is a rescue, how that is an Exodus. But if you compare the account here in Luke with the other two in Matthew and Mark, you find that Luke adjusts words throughout to draw explicit connections back to Moses and that mountain in Exodus. For instance, it is not just that Jesus' face shines. In Luke, he adds the word, the appearance of his face was different. And that word for appearance is what Moses sees on the top of the mountain when he looks at the tabernacle. He sees the appearance of a tabernacle. Those are the blueprints for the tabernacle he's going to build. Luke wants us to see that somehow Jesus is connected to that tabernacle where Moses goes and gets his face glory topped up. Until this point in the narrative, you might have been thinking that Jesus is just another Moses, on the same level with Moses, but the narrative wants you to know that Jesus is greater than Moses. And that's why this voice comes from heaven. And here we finally get the disciples feeling terror, just like the Israelites did when they saw Moses' shining face. But the disciples aren't terrified of Jesus. They are terrified of the cloud, because a good Jew would know that a cloud on a mountain means nothing less than that God's presence is here. And the voice, which can only be God's, says to them, "This is my Son, the chosen. Listen to him." That word chosen is another change that Luke makes, and it is a word with a rich history in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It is most often used to refer to God's chosen people. And so this voice, God's voice, is saying that Jesus is bound up with the promises to Israel, the covenant made with Moses and the Israelites at Mount Sinai. And after the voice has spoken, the cloud and Moses and Elijah disappear, and the disciples are left alone with Jesus. And I love this little detail. Luke does not say Jesus' face went back to normal. Doesn't say that at all. He just says they go down the mountain like Moses did, and the disciples don't tell anybody for a while. And then it's extremely important. So important that I had the option to leave it out this morning, but I kept it in. It's so important that Jesus shines on this mountain, and he goes back down, and Luke connects the healing of the man's only begotten son to that mountaintop experience. It's the third time in Luke where Jesus heals someone's only begotten child. It's a very human moment. This man coming up and said, "I begged your disciples to heal my child, my only son, and they couldn't." Jesus does the mighty act, casts out the demon, heals the child, and all around him are astounded at the greatness of God. Not Jesus' greatness, God's greatness. And that's where our passage ends today, with this connection between Jesus and God and that glory on the mountain. Except the story actually continues. The very next thing Jesus says is, "And now I'm going to Jerusalem, and I'm going to be handed over, and I'm going to die." The disciples don't know what Jesus means, the narrative says, but Luke wants us to connect all these things. He wants us to see that the revelation of Jesus' glory on the mountain and the healing of this person's child are connected, and those two things are then connected to Jesus going to die. What Luke wants us to get is that the glory the disciples see on the mountain is not something that happens just for a moment up there on the mountaintop. That's why Luke reminds us that they had remained awake, or you could have translated it this way: after they were fully awake, they saw Jesus' glory. It helps us understand that Jesus' shining face is not a one-off moment. The story says that instead that the disciples are given the eyes to see what had always been the case, what is the case at the foot of the mountain when Jesus heals that boy? What is the case when Jesus walks the way of the cross and dies at Jerusalem? Jesus isn't just the image of the tabernacle. Jesus is the tabernacle, the dwelling of God's presence among people. All the while, throughout the entirety of his ministry, Jesus' glory shines, even if people cannot see it. The disciples throughout do not understand what is happening in front of them. And I don't think it's an accident that we hear this story about Peter, James, and John going up with Jesus onto a mountaintop to pray, and we hear about the same three going with Jesus at the Garden of Gethsemane to withdraw, to pray. That's the night before Jesus' crucifixion. That night, Jesus' face is changed again. This time, Luke tells us he has drops of sweat falling like blood on the ground. But that night, the narrative tells us the disciples fall asleep. They are not fully awake, which means that they fail to see Jesus' glorious shining even there, even in his struggle to face his death on behalf of the world. It's why we read this story every Sunday before the start of Lent. We do so to remind ourselves that the glory the disciples see on the mountain is not something that stays on the mountain. It is not a borrowed glory like Moses. Jesus' glory is the real thing, which is why when he walks down the mountain, he carries it with him. That glory walks down and heals people on the way to the cross. And on the cross, even the whole world would have thought that the only thing present there was shame, certainly not glory. But even there on the shameful cross, God's glory shone through Jesus even more brightly than it did on that mountain. So this is the journey that we have in front of us that we're about to walk starting on Wednesday. Jesus will say again and again, "It is for this that I have come, to live with humans and to live with them all the way to the very end," which means to die with and for them. But the story says there's more beyond that end. There's a world beyond the world of death. So as we walk these upcoming weeks of Lent, we don't do so as people without hope, because we know the glory of the cross shines through the resurrection on Easter morning. That is how it is in Exodus. That is how it's a rescue. Because if Jesus' resurrection is real, if what Christians believe is real, then we find our place in all of this. We are like Moses. We shine with borrowed glory. But Paul helps us see that we are more than that. Our glory doesn't fade. It is changed from one degree of glory to the next. It is a glory that shines through us, Paul says in 2 Corinthians, even as our bodies break down. We become more and more transparent to the glory of God shining through us. Like that wave that the children see the world beyond the world. That's what we become like. How can you recognize that that's what's happening in your life or in others' lives? We will recognize it when we see us acting like Jesus, healing children, comforting grieving parents, taking care of those in need, even when it comes at great cost to ourselves, even if it means we die. In those moments, people will see through us as those children and that mouse saw through the wave at the world's end to the world beyond. They will see a glory that isn't ours, but is Jesus. And that's why Luke wants us to see Jesus' greatness not on the mountaintop, but at the foot of the mountain, taking care of a grieving father and his suffering son. It's in acts like these that God's glory truly shines through.